Good day, dear audience. It is a pleasure to see you in such a large number here in this room as well, and I hope that we have plenty of viewers joining us online to spend this rather wintry yet green day discussing various hot topics that have become new challenges this year and carried over from last year, mostly in relation to energy supply. And I would first like to thank the European Commission and the European institutions that are one of the parties involved in discussing these issues. And I would like to emphasize that the Green Deal is to a great extent one of the factors, elements why we can still talk about this crisis from a position of observation rather than actual crisis situation where we would find ourselves if we were still in the historical dependency of fossil fuels. My name is Gunārs Valdmanis. I will be the moderator for today's discussion, but normally I am a representative of the NGO representing the Latvian Association of Power Engineers and Energy Constructors, and I am joined today by several very distinguished colleagues who will provide their opinion on these topics. I will allow them to introduce themselves, but first I will give the floor to Maria Teresa, who is a representative of the European Commission. I will ask her to explain the position of the European institutions that have to a great extent been the architects of the existing energy supply system and also drivers of change. So to explain the opinion of the European institutions going forward, what are the possible proposals for the single market to overcome the existing situation and keep on track to reach a more environmentally secure energy supply in future.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about this very important topic, not only for Latvia, but for the whole European Union. So as you all know, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and therefore the individual recovery and resilience plans of the member states, are contributing already a lot to the green transition. And this is because at least 37% of the investments have to be devoted to the green transition, and also all the measures in the plans have to comply with the so-called do no significant harm to the environment. However, it's clear that the current geopolitical situation has asked the European Commission to bring forward new initiatives, a new plan in order to end the EU's dependency on Russian fossil fuels, and also in order to tackle the climate crisis. In order to tackle the climate crisis, we have at European level the European Green Deal, and the current situation brings us to a moment where there is a real need, and this is the willingness of most of the European citizens to move towards, to accelerate these Green Deal objectives, which is for Europe to become climate neutral by 2050. Therefore, it was in mid-May, on the 18th of May, when the European Commission published the so-called REPowerEU plan, which is a plan to rapidly reduce the dependence on Russian fossil fuels and to fast forward the green transition. Here, in this package of initiatives, so the European Commission has brought forward measures, some action plans, some legislative proposals, measures related to energy savings, measures related to diversification of energy supplies, and measures related to acceleration of the rollout of renewables. In addition, in order to kind of strengthen this economic growth, security, and climate action at European level, the European Commission has decided that the Recovery and Resilience Facility and the Recovery and Resilience Plans should be the instrument in order for the member states to bring in reforms and investments related to the areas I just highlighted, and to implement them by 2026. It is clear that in order to do that, member states might need additional funding. And for this, the European Commission is mentioning the fact that there is still a huge envelope of loans available to the member states that they could request for the implementation of reforms and investments, and also has brought forward some ideas, initiatives in order to bring in additional funding, to bring in for all member states additional funding coming from the auctioning of emission trading allowances, and this will bring in around 20 billion euros for the whole European Union. And then also member states will be able to transfer some funding from their cohesion funds or from their agriculture funds, European ones, to the implementation of the REPowerEU plan. So therefore, from the European Commission side, what we are doing is to work all together, the different commissioners, in order to bring forward specific initiatives, as the one I highlighted in the specific areas, in order to accelerate this transition towards the climate neutrality by 2050, and in order to rapidly also reduce the dependence on Russian fuels. So in this regard, it's clear that when the member states will decide to amend the Recovery and Resilience Plan, we will enter into specific discussions specifically for the given member state, for instance, the situation in Latvia, with regard to what type of measures, reforms, and investments are necessary, and for which Latvia could get additional funding. But there is, from the European Commission side, a clear goal to accelerate the green transition, to really increase even the targets to be fulfilled to reach the climate neutrality by 2050, but also to look at Europe as a region, to look at Europe as a whole, and also within the different regions in terms of which are the relevant needs, which are the relevant investments that will be necessary in order to get out, remove the dependence on Russia, but also in order to accelerate the climate neutrality. So that's my initial intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa.
Now switching back to Latvian, I will give the floor to our second speaker, Līga Rozentāle, who represents the Ministry of Economics. She is the Director of the Energy Market and Infrastructure Department. So perhaps you could present in your own words the main messages that the Ministry of Economics has on the issue of the Green Deal and energy security. Yes, hello, and thank you for your introduction. And from the Ministry of Economics, we would like to thank the European Commission for the recommendations and assistance we've had in energy security issues. From the point of view of the Ministry of Economics, I could say that the main priorities that we are working towards in regard to energy issues have not really changed, because in the existing geopolitical situation, we have always believed that the priority is a diversification of energy sources, energy efficiency, when just in the past few months we have found ourselves in a situation where we simply have to accelerate moving towards these priorities, moving towards energy independence. That is exactly what we are trying to do at the moment, and we have divided our task into three stages: short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Short-term measures have already been started immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just a couple of days later, we already began the pumping season for the Inčukalns gas reservoir, which is usually begun later in the year, but so far we have pumped in more gas into the reservoir than usually. And another immediate step that was taken was to task the energy supplier Latvian to increase the amount of gas purchased from the LNG terminal in Klaipēda, which was immediately also purchased and already stored at Inčukalns. Technically, we prioritized flows from the Klaipēda LNG terminal in order to ensure that they have priority over gas coming in from Russia. At the moment, the Cabinet of Ministers has already taken a decision on creating a gas reserve, which will be in effect as of January of next year. And here again, Latvian has been tasked to purchase these gas reserves that will be the property of the state. So we are doing everything we can to ensure energy security in the short term. We also see that both in the short term and long term, the Paldiski terminal in Estonia will be of extreme importance, which will allow us to increase the amount of natural gas available. And of course, we are also discussing the opportunities to use EU funds by all households to improve their energy efficiency. We have EU funds for household energy efficiency, solar panels. We have a program specifically aimed at businesses for energy efficiency measures to change their equipment or install solar panels. And municipalities have also expressed a lot of interest in programs providing assistance in changing heating equipment in municipalities and so forth. So we are urging people to take advantage of these programs. We have see this as a midterm solution because there are many projects that are perhaps not begun yet, or it's not possible to begin them immediately, but they will be started next year, for example, to ensure energy efficiency going forward. And in the long term, of course, we see that renewable resources, wind farms, large solar farms are what we should be going towards to, of course, also ensure higher energy efficiency, but we also need stable base capacities. We see various alternative solutions that we can work on, perhaps nuclear power, where we see that by the end of next year we could elaborate a nuclear power program to assess the options of creating small nuclear plants in Latvia. We're not talking about a major nuclear plant, we're just discussing a small capacity nuclear plant. We're discussing the alternatives and possibilities of introducing such plants. These are long-term solutions where we're looking towards 2030 or even beyond that. Also, we're looking at increasing the share of hydrogen power, but overall, what we need to focus on at the moment are solutions that we can implement immediately. These are projects that we have already been working on, such as wind farms. We are very appreciative of the European Commission allowing more RFF funds to be allocated for some of these projects. We see that it is very important to understand what will be the criteria for allocating funding going forward and what will be the criteria for using the available funding. Taking into consideration that the Cabinet of Ministers has taken a decision on creating a LNG terminal in Latvia as well. This does not quite fit under green goals, but we are in a situation today where our green goals are important, but we also have to understand what the geopolitical situation is. We have to see how funding can be allocated also to various projects that may not fit with green objectives, but ensure energy security.
I will just add a short note. During the last months, we've seen that some stakeholders really have developed expectations towards institutions of public administration and policymakers, like please provide us with natural gas and renewables. But at this point, I would like to underscore, and especially in the context of the European Commission, that one of the basic principles of the reforms was open market, meaning that this supply of natural gas is organized by merchants in a free market, and the state is not the direct buyer, is not purchasing directly. These times are gone when the Prime Minister of Latvia went to the president of the aggressive neighboring country and begged for discounts. This is no longer the case. We have many market players, market operators who are very professional, who have gained experience. So this is not really the matter only for the state. And also we have to think about the users as well and the strategies in this area, but now about the role of municipalities and local governments. And local governments indeed have been one of those who were driving forward the green transformation. And local governments are using renewables and have been very active market participants. But now the situation has changed again because we have new challenges, and local governments can no longer be only active users and producers of energy, companies supply, but they have to now assume new functions. To a large extent, yes, they have to think about safety, security and social stability as well. That's why I would like now to hear the opinion of Andra Feldmane, representing Latvian Association of Local and Regional Governments. What's the opinion of your organization? What should be done to help on your level? Because you are closer to the majority of society, you are closer to grassroots. What should be done, and what are you expecting from other stakeholders? How they could support you. Thank you for your introductory words, and I have to say that indeed yesterday at our association we had a meeting yesterday, and we were thinking about what we wanted to tell you, especially because we have a representative from the Commission here, and the message is definitely REPowerEU plan. It's a story about reforms. And reforms, well, we need clean energy, free from Russian gas and oil products. That's clear to all of us. But the gas that we are using in heating, and it's of vital importance for us. I'm not going now to list all local governments, but we have 5 local governments for whom gas is the most important element for heating. And so these local governments still have risks. Approximately 70% of local governments have transformed successfully their heating systems, and for them gas is reserved 10–20% of the total consumption of heating energy. And they are using pellets, but we know know that now wooden product prices are increasing very, and this increase is very sharp. And our forecast is that the increase could be by 200% compared to the previous year. So the question is, how do we enter this heating season, and how do our households look? And we are not speaking only about poor households, but we have to think about households in general, and we have to put this question, we have to ask these questions, these households, whether the number of households which are not well-to-do is not going to increase, because this Russian madness in Ukraine will influence also employment. And this is quite clear at the moment. So the question is, how are we going to help companies, and how people are going to earn their salary to lead lives worthy of human dignity, because people have to pay for food and for heating and electricity, and we know that these prices are going to increase. But now thinking about Green Deal and about regulations and directives, what we, local governments, what we see that that our line ministries are transposing directives and regulations and imposing new obligations upon local governments. Quite recently, the Ministry of Economics adopted or amended the transport law, and we just know that in 2024, 50% should be, we have to provide renewables in 50%. But this means that we really have to make huge investments, and we have now financing for it. And so we have to think also about demand and supply. Well, I have hold a doctoral degree in economics. So my question always is, when we impose an obligation, some kind of responsibility, how can we implement it? Now we are trying to develop demand through regulations and laws, but we are not looking at the companies, also capacities of those who are providing public service, and also the ability of our households to pay for it. To my mind, it is quite shocking for us, and it's bad that we are transposing regulations and directives like one-to-one, but the level of income of our households is below the European average. So we cannot do exactly what other member states are able to do. And if we look also at the increase of GDP per capita, we also fall behind Estonians and Lithuanians. And that's why this whole matter of demand, we say, yes, we need this, and we have to do all of this. And also now, when we speak about heating, we have to, of course, we have to transform the systems, but we need investments. And I believe that commercial banks will provide loans to Riga and the region around Riga, but other regions might have problems. And well, commercial banks also have expressed their concern. Well, local governments are very close to companies and also very close to residents. So we have to think about how we are going to live. And when we start looking for some kind of compensation mechanisms, we can say that the government this spring was very helpful. We had compensation for households and also for grids. But what's going to happen in the next heating season? We don't know. We lack information. And also the question is whether the companies will have the resources to transit to those green technologies. And actually, in our association, we meet, well, we see all legal acts coming from all ministries, and we see that we also, there's this component of loans and credits. But then we always have to think about the price of the service or the goods and the interest rate demanded that will be demanded by commercial banks. And we have to think about companies and institutions and agencies, whether we will be able to pay for the services and provide the services. And to conclude my address, it's not in vain that the European Commission has been looking for solutions, including the directive on renewables, encouraging residents and companies to establish these energy communities. And we see this as a very promising line. And we see it very well, for example, whenever we see wind farms and solar energy farms. But for us, this directive is very important because we can establish energy community only if we, as a natural person or legal person, have invested financial resources into a wind farm or solar farm. If we do not become shareholders, then we cannot use the advantages of this energy community and use electricity for self-consumption that is quite cheap. Well, in short term, we have many issues that we have to still consider, relating both to inhabitants and to our companies and businesses. Definitely, if we, through Green Deal, we would be able to become more independent. Local governments are willing to cooperate with the private sector. And of course, we have all those opportunities as the energy community, which I just mentioned, that could be a very promising solution. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Of course, I have all kinds of additional questions and about the energy community. Two comments. I believe that this is really a very promising trend. But perhaps society might take a different look on it. Actually, by establishing the energy community, the user understands what it costs, what are the capital investments, and also to a large extent appreciates and understands what this really energy costs. The price perhaps is not that different, but the owner sometimes appreciates his or her investments more. And of course, we see that sometimes a person has to really calculate to understand the returns of the capital investment and to understand whether and then perhaps would see also major companies in a different light. When we buy an equipment and understand what the price is and what all the related costs are and how you have to maintain the equipment. And another comment, and our organization is also going to support this idea. We have to understand that communities, of course, but that communities should never become an element that distorts competition. And if we sort of leave aside emotional considerations, well, market is useful for all. For the producer who is producing for its own needs and for the needs of others. So these major professional companies remain necessary for us. And we will need these major companies also in the future. I believe that's very important to really to find balance between new initiatives and I will take the liberty to say traditional energy producers, major companies that are producing electricity and heat. These are my very brief comments, but now Bet tagad es pārslēgšos uz angļu valodu, lai atkal
ask Maria Teresa
uzdotu
to intervene with some of her thoughts. As you heard from our discussions, one of the focus points we are right now actually facing right now in our challenges regarding is development of new natural gas infrastructure, which, as Līga already pointed out, we do not consider quite green. On the other hand, we could always argue that it can be used in the future for example, for transporting and storage of renewable energy resources such as hydrogen or biomethane or methane, which is produced from the hydrogen in a respective process. So it can become, let's say, a bridge towards a greener energy supply. But what view generally right now European Commission takes on such investments which are directed towards traditional infrastructure?
Yes, very pertinent questions. And it's clear that the climate neutrality by 2050 is a goal to be achieved. Therefore, any investment in fossil fuel energy has to be looked very carefully in order to clearly assess whether that investment is absolutely necessary. Because what is clear is that if the money, the financing, goes to this type of investment, it doesn't go to renewables or other type of measures that could help moving towards the climate neutrality by 2050, could help accelerating. So there is a kind of cost of opportunity also, depending on the type of investment. Of course, what it is necessary when we talk about infrastructure is to look at the specific region and then at Europe as a whole, but then going into specific regions. And the European Commission on the 18th of May with the REPowerEU plan published an annex in which we took on board the assessment by ENTSO-G, which is the European organization in charge of all the interconnections on gas in Europe, where this association brought forward their thinking about where are the investments needs in terms of infrastructure. And there are specific elements brought forward with regard to specific regions. Also, in terms of the recovery and resilience plan, we have included in our proposal that is now being negotiated in the European Parliament and the Council, specific provisions that says that for infrastructure related to fossil fuels and linked to the security of supply, this could be financed by the RRF, by the Recovery and Resilience Facility, even if those type of investments would not comply with the do no significant harm. So there is a kind of exemption for this type of investments, but for which it is absolutely necessary to prove that the investment is needed, that will not become stranded assets, that will not become kind of a way to, instead of accelerating, reducing the speed to reach the climate neutrality goal. So these are all these elements. And in this regard, well, to say that in this annex, with the assessment by the ENTSO-G, they are not explicitly mentioned an LNG terminal in Latvia. So therefore, if the intention of the Latvian government is to invest on this, they will have to talk with the relevant authorities in Europe, meaning my colleagues in the Secretariat-General for Energy and the relevant bodies, European bodies, in order to justify the real need for the region. Because what we should not do either is that through this type of investments, here or in the Mediterranean or in other member states, what we do is to increase the gas consumption when actually the goal is just to accelerate the climate neutrality and move out also from fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you. It was really direct and a good answer. I now switch a little bit back to Latvian because I want to address this specific question to all of you.
So another issue that has become very topical over the course of the past couple of months, and we also discussed it recently with the colleagues from the European Commission as well, and I think it would be worthwhile to discuss it here today, being the resource such as peat. Tad kūdra, kas ir nozīmīgs Latvijas resurs, kas
but is considered right now rather controversial. I have heard in recent months arguments on both sides, and I have no, let's say, clear answer for myself, because I know technically that it can be used quite efficiently for heat production, but I at the same time know that appliance on energy power production is very limited. But of course, there is a political decision to be made actually how we perceive this, whether it's sustainable or not, or renewable or not. So your view, and I will ask colleagues also from both from Ministry of Economy and from municipalities, yes, also to reflect on that issue, because let me just give you a few arguments. Surely, maybe it's not the most greenest way how to consume this product, which it can be, and producers emphasize themselves, it can be used as a very good resource for gardening, for agriculture, which is really, I consider, sustainable way to use it. On the other hand, as an emergency supply reserve for few hard years, again, I think many will argue it's much better to maybe store a little bit of this peat in the storage rather than to suffer cold during the winter. So,
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert on these issues, and I will go back to the general principles, about the fact that we have, and here in Latvia, you have very short-term needs that were highlighted before, but we need to think also about the long-term, which is the long-term goal. And therefore, it's this balance that the authorities will have to take into consideration when taking decisions. And what is clear is that, for instance, there is more a policy to say, okay, instead of gas boilers, move to heat pumps, and not to do the reversal, instead of gas, going back to other type of fuel, fossil fuel. So it's something that has to be carefully assessed, and as said, the intention is to move out from the Russian fossil fuels, but also to move out completely from fossil fuels. And it's an element that has to be taken into consideration when thinking about which is the best short-term strategy, taking into consideration the long-term goal to which all the European member states have agreed. It's clear that you mentioned before other type of possible renewable energies, such as renewable hydrogen or biomethane. So these are elements that are being discussed, and also on the 18th of May there was a biomethane action plan presented. There were additional elements for the European hydrogen strategy. So other type of renewable fuels instead of possible additional fossil fuels. But as I'm saying, I'm not an expert on the energy issues. I'm sure that the other panelists will be able to say more. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, you still answered quite a lot, but yes, of course, this peat is one of resources which, let's say, is under great debate whether to consider it renewable or fossil. And as I said, arguments are on both sides, of course. But I will switch now to Latvian and tātad došu vārdu varbūt Līgai.
Līga, I know that this is a controversial issue of whether peat is a renewable resource or a fossil fuel. So from the point of view of a policymaker, do you see any prospects for this resource? I think that we should stick to the strategic plan that we have in place, and this means that the only fossil fuel we still use is natural gas. And this is also why we need to create a new LNG terminal in order to ensure the supply of natural gas, but we should not bring in other fossil resources into this if we have already moved away from them before. So gas we have not yet removed from our energy supply, and we still need it while we are transitioning to renewable resources. And for the time being that we cannot fully move away from fossil fuels, then we are using it, but since we have not been using peat so forth, I don't think we should start using it now. Yes, and so what about municipalities? What is your perspective of the benefits of using these resources, such as perhaps setting up reserves or surplus reserves, but also taking into consideration the EU position, which could perhaps sometimes be incompatible with what society believes to be the right course forward. Yes, thank you. This is an important issue. And if we speak about peat, I have to mention the area of gardening. And what I think would not be correct is if we were to ban the use of peat in gardening, because we do have this as a resource, and this is an important resource for agriculture. The second point I'd like to make is about peat in energy. Yes, we have the transitioning fund in place to move away from using peat in energy, but here we have to understand what type of peat we are speaking about, because when extracting peat from bogs, there is one layer of peat that is perfect for use in heating. And we have discussed this with the Heating Supply Association as well to assess the expenses needed to set up these special filters and special equipment in heating facilities to be able to use this layer of peat, and to assess whether these investments are rational and viable, because this would allow us to reduce heating costs for households at this time of crisis. This is my subjective opinion that this would be justified, because if we speak about LNG, of course, this is the story of there being a war at our doorstep, and we have to look outside the box for solutions. And we would not need an LNG terminal at home if there weren't the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So the question is, how much would it cost for us to adapt the existing heating production facilities? And if this is a cheaper alternative, then I think it would be justified, because here again we have to compare the price of gas, wood, heat pumps, peat, solar panels, and this will give us a clear answer. Yes, Thank you. I actually have two additional questions now, and I also have a question that was sent in from our listeners. So let's begin with our external question first, which is closely related to my industry as well. Namely, at the moment, we find ourselves in a situation where the demand for renewable energy, for network capacities to ensure the allocation of this renewable energy is actually reaching its limit. So I'll leave the details to our colleagues from the distribution networks and organizations, but just overall, at the moment, we have approximately 700 megawatt capacity, and the new applications for capacities actually exceed this amount already. So what I would like to ask you at this time is that, first of all, we have a need for additional capacities and perhaps changing the management model. Obviously, the municipalities play a role here as well as national government, because network regulations do not at the moment allow for rejecting applications even if they are unsustainable. And secondly, perhaps this situation actually that we find ourselves at the moment creates additional demand for renewable energy that we haven't seen before. So here I'd ask the European Commission, that jautājums komisijai, cik lielā mērā nākotnē
additional investments for this green transition. We received from the recovery fund a certain amount, which was below, it's sad to say, but below what we would wanted. But of course, well, yes, there are many needs, but how do you look in the future? And I will ask the same question, but with some additions also to other colleagues, but please, your view on that.
Thank you. No, it is clear that for the increase of renewables, so the increase of investments in renewables, it is necessary to have the legal framework reforms necessary, in order to make sure that these investments can be done quickly and under legal certainty. But it's clear that it is necessary that the relevant infrastructure, as the grid connections, are there. So that's clear. It's evident that, as you highlighted in a previous remark, what from the European Commission we want with this EU funding, also for the energy, REPowerEU, is to crowd in private investment. So there is public funding coming from the EU for specific projects that the relevant member states and Latvia will bring forward, because the plan belongs to the member state, belongs to Latvia. They will bring forward some ideas that we'll be discussing whether they fit with the country-specific recommendations and the specific obligation of the recovery and resilience funds. But so there will be European funding, but there is European funding when reforms are there to make sure that the investments will be productive, positive, and will crowd in more private investment. How much funding it will be, I mean, this will depend on the discussions we'll have with the Latvian authorities in terms of whether they want to take part of the loans, and which part of the loans, for what kind of projects, whether there is this additional funding coming from the auctioning of emission trading allowances, and what is the amount that belongs to Latvia concerning the grants. So this is a question that we will have to discuss with the Latvian authorities. But as said, from the European Commission perspective, it's very important not just to build infrastructure. It's very important to build also the environment, the business environment, and also taking into consideration also the social situation in the country in order to make sure that it works and that we move towards this goal of climate neutrality by 2050, but from all the perspectives, taking into consideration social aspects, environmental aspects, economic aspects.
Thank you very much. I'm of course inclined to take what I want to hear and pass this message also that that grids and networks need this investment for the transition, and this is one way to create this environment. So thank you for that, and I hope that our policy makers and decision makers and politicians hear that very well. Bet tagad pāriešu atkal pie Līgas. Līga noteikti es neesmu pirmais cilvēks, kurš jau ir
who has given you this signal about the grids, that the grids are starting to reach the limit of demand, to the limit of new capacities that we can grant. Well, but in this regard, it's very important also to speak about reserved capacities. Currently, we are reserving in the grid surplus capacity, which people are not using, both private persons, but mainly I'm speaking here about companies. And so these capacities are reserved. Perhaps there's some kind of business plan to resell the capacity to a third person for use. So these capacities are not used, but still in the grid they are reserved for a couple of years until these technical rules are enforced. So we have to really deal with the technical problem, with this problem. Actually, the grids are not full. Of course, we have to develop them, but only when they have indeed reached the capacity. But now we have to deal with these reservations, with the reserves of capacities. And actually, we have proposed amendments to the energy market law, and there will be payment for reserving capacity, which will be applied by the system operator when a client comes with a request requesting technical rules. And actually, this draft law is close to the third reading in the Parliament. And so we hope that we'll be able to deal with it. And also those companies who have serious projects and really with real plans to implement them will turn to system operators. And they will also have to make security payment for this. And this money will be used for developing grids. Well, thank you. This is a very important message. Actually, that's what I also wanted to underscore, that some of those capacities are fictitious. And so this is a hindrance also for developing energy communities. Someone has already reserved the capacity and is waiting for some kind of a good situation or business plan, or perhaps just hindering others in their development. Well, thank you for what you just said. It's very important, and it was very also important to hear from you here, and because we will have to foreground this matter, and also among companies, because again we will see some kind of interests clashing here. But in this discussion, I also want to see the perspective of municipalities, and I would like to really express my compliments. I have been involved in these processes. I've seen the way municipalities cooperate with network operators, grid operators, how the capacities are being developed, looking from the demand side, what the region sees, what kind of development trends the municipality sees in its territory, and really gives this message in a quite detailed way to the grid. And so the investments can be planned. So we see this very good cooperation. But my question is, do you see the possibility, by using the administrative instruments that you have at your disposal, somehow to become involved in the process? This has happened in some cases in a rather controversial way. But indeed, you really reflect the opinion, the public opinion, which sometimes does not coincide with energy security considerations, but is also legitimate. Well, I will start by answering your question about solar farms. They give the energy that they produce to the grid, and we have identified one thing. Actually, according to the it's enough to have technical rules, and the solar farms are not quite regulated, and they can be developed in any territory where an agreement has been reached with the landowner. When the landowner leases the land. But the risk that I see in connection with this war in Ukraine, we really have to look at the lands that are now used for solar farms. These also sometimes are agricultural lands. We really have to look at it. But the currently valid legal regulation does not allow the local government to become involved and to influence it. The other story, of course, is a story about the wind farms. The energy is used in the grid, and in Kurzem, we know in Kurzem region is very promising, very promising. We are going to have many wind farms there. Local municipalities are trying to really develop this compromise platform, allowing development of wind farms. But another point where we don't see a solution yet, if we have like 80 million for developing of industrial territories, and this really allows the municipality to transform local economy and to invite strong and major foreign companies. And then we have the situation, there is a foreign investor coming to a particular municipality and is developing a huge production facility. They have a surplus amount of electricity and heating. But we all know that industrial territories are not situated close to cities. They are quite far away from cities. So the question is how to use this electricity, this heating, how to use it, not to waste it. So here we have to think about solutions. For grids, it's very hard to take this energy. You have to build then grids, and that would be very expensive. But we have to think about solutions for this situation. And I believe that in connection with this program of industrial territories, these problems will arise more frequently. And I am drawing attention to this fact because we know that the European Commission's position is that industrially produced heat and electricity is as valuable as gold. We cannot afford to waste it. Whatever is not needed for this production company should be given and used. And we still have not found a solution to this. A very brief comment. I cannot really uphold the opinion that the grids would not, that our grid operators would not have the money for development, for investments. I would rather say that our legal regulation clearly defines the development. And if the company is not ready to cover the costs, our grid operator cannot do it. It's not according to the law. So this cannot turn into additional costs for the grid, because that would influence the tariffs for other users, for us. But it's just a very brief comment, because we have to remember that all this area is strictly regulated. But now I'd like to turn to this rather burning matter, And this is the coming heating season, the next heating season. So, Andra, what's your opinion? What can be done? I heard already some important matters that were highlighted, but there are some other tools that have been used historically in this sector of heating. All kinds of reserve heating resources or so what's the current situation? What the municipalities have done or using also those heating facilities, also perhaps adjusting existing heating facilities, or using propane or using diesel fuel. So the way I see it, perhaps this would allow companies to make some kind of reserves. And another sort of tool or instrument, this equalized payment, I don't know whether it's still used so that people would not really feel shocked when at the moment when a heating season starts, at that month, in that month the invoice is huge. And in summer people live in peace, like paying rather symbolic price. So this equalized payment used to be an accepted practice. Well, I'll start by responding to your question regarding equalized payment. But well, that would seem logical. When we buy pellets, we buy them, of course, when it's available. And companies, of course, do this to the extent they can afford it. But we also have to think whether the consumers have those free resources that can be invested into creating those reserves. It's usually linked to the tariff of the within the local municipality. We have discussed possible solutions, and a good solution would be to give to households and to companies the possibility to pay each month a definite amount of money, so that the household would make those advance payments to the heating company during the summer months and also during warm autumn, but then during winter months then this money could be used. Unfortunately, the legal regulation on public service does not allow it. Those service providers cannot demand advance payments from consumers. Perhaps this is a matter to be solved in the future, but whether it's going to solve the situation now, I believe it's now too late. It's not too late. We have also discussed this with colleagues at the Ministry of Economics. We've been talking about heat pumps and solar panels and whatnot. But then we all understand this is what we had to do last year when prices were lower and we could have purchased these technologies. Currently, well, we are in the boat that we are in, and we somehow have to get this boat with the resources that we have and the powers that we have into safety. And perhaps you could repeat your second question or the first question, because I started speaking about equalized payments and forgot the first part of your question.
Yes, well, if we speak about purchasing resources outside of the heating season, you already did answer this question partially, because what I wanted to know is whether the municipalities that have heating facilities that are adaptable to other types of fuel, such as diesel, have you discussed the possibility of worst-case scenario that diesel can be used and purchased at a price that is not as linked to natural gas prices. Obviously, it is high, but if we look at early spring, at the beginning of the year, diesel was actually a competitive resource in terms of price. Well, municipality association doesn't really have information about heating plants that are capable of using diesel fuel. Most of our municipalities use wood pellets, wood shavings, various construction biomaterials, peat, gas, solar energy. Those are the main resources that we use. Oil or diesel, this isn't really a resource that we use. If there are any municipalities, then this is a minor amount that can be used. If we look at Riga, we have water heating facilities that can be run with diesel fuel. Yes, but this is a very specific case. The thermal cogeneration plants are unique in that they do provide heating to a part of the city of Riga, but well, so I did actually get my answer to my question about municipalities setting up reserves of fuel, so perhaps Līga has something to say about this. Well, if we look at the support mechanisms that were available in the last heating season, they were adapted to the existing prices, but as the Ministry of Economy is not the one to be able to prioritize who is deserving of more support or less. So we're not the ones that divide households into levels of income to decide who gets what amount of funding, but this is something that we have to resolve by the next heating season. This is something that the Ministry of Welfare has taken the lead on to decide which groups of households are deserving of the highest amount of assistance and setting limits to which compensation will be given to households for energy costs. And so from a technical perspective, have you assessed the options of replacing fuels in Latvia, so in the worst case scenario that we all want to avoid, and precisely why we act to avoid it? Have you assessed, for example, where propane diesel could be used? No, we haven't had such a detailed assessment at the moment. If we look at the municipal level, there are many that are already replacing their heating plants and equipment, and we have set up a plan for the amount of natural gas that we need, how much electricity we need. So we've planned this for the coming year. So we don't expect to have any shortages. We think that the situation is stable. Yes, so that's a very good message, a positive one. And my next question then is what we already touched upon. So it is my understanding that you are planning certain social assistance measures. Yes, we are the support given to vulnerable users is ongoing and will be continued in the coming years. So these are vulnerable groups such as people with disabilities, multi-children households, pensioners, etc. So at the moment, we have the highest level of support is 20 euros, and then by €5 increments it decreases, but this is a horizontal measure. And then we have other support measures. Today we actually had the first working group meeting organized by the Ministry of Welfare to discuss support mechanisms that will be used during the next heating season. So our aim is to have something on the table for cabinet ministers by June. All right, well, my next question then is about energy supply challenges, namely whether we can really be sure that the reserves at Inčukalns is the highest that we've ever had in the month of May. It is, of course, also clear that the trends in the energy market are such that it is that we can forecast low demand for natural gas for the next couple of months, which would allow us to maintain the reserves for the heating season. However, there are various scenarios possible for what happens when the heating season actually begins. So, how do we ensure that we have enough reserves for the beginning of the heating season? Because there are certain concerns about the capacities of neighboring country infrastructure. There are concerns about how the latest decisions from Russia will impact the situation moving forward. So what is the ministry's opinion about this at the moment? Well, we have to understand that at the moment we have already submitted amendments to the energy law on removing Russian gas from our energy system. So the only question is whether we will implement a transition period until 1st of January. So if we continue receiving the gas supplies from Russia by until January 1st, if this would be legally possible to pay for them with euros, then this would be a sort of security net to ensure that if our other projects are delayed, then we still have proper supply. But Latvenergo has already reserved enough amount of gas to obtain enough that will be needed for the heating season, and we have constantly available capacities from the Klaipėda terminal because the distributors constantly purchase more than they actually need, and then they sell it on forward. And we also have this interconnection with Poland. As of November, we will also be have access to the Paldiski terminal. So we see that there will not be any problems with supply in the next heating season. And do you have any information already about the gas flows from continental Europe to the Baltics? Are these going the way that we expect them to? As far as we know, Poland had made reservations for the Klaipėda terminal, but we've also received news that these capacities that have been reserved have not been used fully, so Poland has not used everything that they put a reservation on, so that means that we have more flows coming our way as well. I'd definitely like to hear the opinion of the municipalities as well. One aspect is what we already discussed and heard from Līga, is that the market is functioning, but from the point of view of municipalities, I think that the situation is different. For example, contractual terms are different for various municipalities. They've signed their contracts at different points in time, and last year many municipalities had very different situations. So some had signed contracts ahead of time, so when the gas prices were still low, so they were able to provide very competitive prices to their users and feel very comfortable. But when these contracts ran out, then the situation starkly changed the very next day. So what is the situation at the moment with these contracts? How sure are you about them? How much discounts have been provided and so forth? Yes, this is a very challenging question indeed. And from our point of view and from the Association of Municipalities, our energy experts that look at the amount of gas needed, we have concerns about January, about the price of gas then, but our biggest concern is whether we will actually have this gas available. This is what our experts are saying. So what we are trying to do is to move away from using gas altogether, right? 20, 30, 40% as much as possible. Because what we are seeing is that any transformation with solar farms or heat pumps, they require a lot of time. We need a technical project, geological assessment, and so forth. So it takes about a year and a half at least. So this is not something that we can implement immediately. What we cannot forecast and what we do have concerns about is that we recall the story of what happened with electricity. When electricity prices began rising, many distributors just sort of opted out of their contracts, withdrew, and then we had the situation where a municipality transfers money, and the next day they receive a notice that unfortunately, due to the price increase, we have filed for bankruptcy, or for some other reason we have to withdraw from the contract. So this is a risk that we are taking into consideration, but there's nothing we can do about it. From our association, the only thing that we can do is seek alternatives, but this is a problem that we simply have to deal with. And if we look at biomethane and putting it through gas pipelines, obviously we understand that this alternative fuel also needs certain facilities that require investments, and we will not be able to establish these necessary facilities by this autumn. So there are many things that we should have already done last year, but as regards the upcoming season, we do have many concerns, and I don't want to escalate this situation, but we are very concerned about January and February of next year. Thank you. I'd also like to come back to the long-term perspective a bit more and speak about the European Commission's position.
Focus my question towards you, but what I would like to say, many of our discussions, actually, what we are discussing here, in many ways reflect that Latvia is quite unique from one perspective. It has a rather high penetration of centralized heating systems in comparison with most of the European Union countries. So we are, let's say, in a rather good situation from that point of view in comparison with many countries, but we are facing also quite specific challenges which may differ from what people in other European countries are facing in the same situation. One remark, yes, it's important to keep in mind all the time that Latvia is not unique at all in this situation that we are facing, and this is in one way bad news, of course, in one way good news, because it means that we are not suffering from a loss of competitiveness in comparison with our European partners. But yes, this centralized heating, how do you actually see in a long-term perspective European Union energy strategy, the role of centralized heating?
Yeah. Well, actually, when following the discussion, I have noted down individual heat meters, kind of to say that in the framework of the REPowerEU package, the European Commission has also published a communication on EU safe energy, meaning energy saving. So there is a call also from the European Commission side to change behaviors of citizens in terms of saving energy. And of course, this is changing behaviors, but sometimes in order to change behaviors, it is necessary also to have the right tools to do so. And that's why I was thinking about these individual heat meters in terms of reducing consumption, no? When talking about paying the bills, okay, if the bill corresponds more to what I'm consuming myself in terms of energy, maybe I can help, no, in terms of reducing, because according to this communication of the Commission, it is said that in short term, these behavioral changes could cut gas and oil demand by 5%. So it's not minimal, no, given the situation in which we are. So what is clear is that from the European Commission, we are calling to the member states to invest and create the frameworks for investments on energy efficiency and to use all the necessary tools that are available in terms of renovation, in terms of individual heat meters, in terms of also making sure that there is less consumption of energy where it can be saved, because it's clear that we need energy in our societies, but we need to make sure that it's the consumption is done in a rational way, taking into consideration the overall frame circumstances in which we are.
Okay, thank you for this answer. And now I will return again to Latvian. Tātad kolēģiem man vēl viens jau mēs jau tuvojam.
As we are approaching the end of our discussion, I think that what's become clear in our discussion is that society in general has been used to the carrot method up until this crisis. And if this was a viable method before, then as a representative of the industry joining these discussions, it was often, I was displeased to see the opinion of society about energy efficiency projects sometimes, because taking into consideration the low cost of energy that municipalities were able to ensure previously, these projects were not as attractive as they are today. So it's understandable that the opinions that maybe people used to have, but perhaps, what is your opinion? Is this not the time to sort of start employing the whip a little bit more as well alongside the carrots? Because if we look at household statistics, then businesses are actually, and state institutions are much farther ahead than households, and households are the sort of more painful point that we still have. So do we still just stick with the carrot, or do we take out the whip? Well, as regards energy efficiency, we all know the saying that the best energy is the one that we don't use. And energy efficiency is indeed priority number one at the moment. I have to say that municipalities and businesses have pretty much done their homework, and I think that the available structural funds had a lot to do with this as well. Multi-apartment buildings are a more complicated story, and here the municipalities that were more active, more enthusiastic in helping people set up these technical designs and carry out energy efficiency audits, The only concern was the quality of these energy audits, because I think we all know that the conclusion of an energy audit could have sometimes been very poor, and then when these households take these audits to the institutions, they encounter many problems. So in the last planning period, Altum set up a special expertise center with the aim of reducing the mistakes made by energy auditors in order to help people maximize the available funding, use it to the best extent. So construction prices rose, and this created certain delays in many of these projects. It made it more difficult for these apartment building maintenance services to oversee the construction works, and Altum did not have the capacity to provide assistance in this regard either. So the implementation of these projects were to a great extent dependent on the enthusiasm of the relevant municipalities. But there are many apartment buildings that are actually ready to implement these energy efficiency projects, but construction costs have skyrocketed over the past month or so, and so many people are actually reassessing whether they have the financial capacity to implement the energy efficiency projects, because the Altum grants will not be increased, and I can't tell you by heart what the support funding was allocated so far, but the question is whether many of these buildings, or the inhabitants of many of these buildings, will be able to cover these higher construction costs, but obviously there is no other alternative anyway. Yes, well, thank you for touching upon this important issue as partially a representative of the construction sector as well. Obviously, our sector cannot cover costs of property that is not our own. So, of course, we cannot cover the cost of construction materials in place of the inhabitants of these buildings. This is a problem that we understand from the side of the customer, but definitely from the side of the constructors, who this isn't something that we can really change. So, Līga, what is your opinion? Well, energy efficiency is promoted when people have the sense that their cost afterwards will be less. And so if we provide support for absolutely everyone and compensate the increase of energy prices, then this removes the incentive, because people no longer feel the need to make their homes more energy efficient if they don't feel the pressure of the rising prices. That is exactly why the ministries are trying to set up these levels of social groups of which are deserving of what level of support in order to maintain this sort of certain pressure of energy prices to incentivize energy efficiency. Well, we've reached the end of our discussion, of our very lively discussion. We didn't really have any lulls in our discussion today, so I would like to thank our panelists who joined us today. So from the European Commission, Maria Teresa, Fernandez for presenting the European Commission's perspective, Līga Rozentāle from the Ministry of Economy, and Feldmane from the Latvian Municipalities Association. So thank you very much to our panelists and all of our listeners for your very active discussion, and I hope that we all have something to take with us for food for thought for upcoming discussions. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you very much.